Now the first of the E's in Riddell's war chest, the Glossary, emotionally directed reasoning. It's a psychological term that encapsulates the phrase, I feel it, therefore I know it. If I feel it, then it must be true. The great majority of emotions are actually sourced in the volitional centres of the brain. This is because most, but not all feelings merely reflect earlier conclusions and thinking patterns habitualised, and are therefore not a very reliable guide to how things really are. And if one's background includes trauma, abuse, drug addiction, parental abandonment or severe dysfunction, then one's feelings will frequently misconstrue the shape of reality. This then forms a terrible loop. Feelings acted on without a check on their validity often bring about the very thing the person fears. I feel offended, therefore I must have been insulted, is probably the most common version of this common and commonly missed phenomena. It is a primary cause of divorce and offence, and the reason why some people are impossibly difficult to live or even work with. It is also the engine that drives the leftist woke machine and many emotional addictions which all cultures are prone to. The emotions that are always obeyed just get more and more demanding, and if not curtailed earlier on in life, they eventually become strong enough to overpower the moral compass and will of the spirit of the person made subject to them. Some type of addiction and or compulsive avoidance always ensues from emotion-based reasoning. Number 2 on the E in the glossary is the equity-orientated ethos. By inviting others to leverage their own privilege as well, whether the nature of that privilege is in terms of gender or class, colour, or just the privilege to speak up without fear of persecution. But when it results in the force-fitting of unsuitable people into groups, into positions, into offices in order to achieve equality of outcome, it usually has disastrous and unintended results. The analogy may be referenced here of some runners in a race being held back and others moved further up the track in order that all may cross the line at just the same time. This analogy serves to illustrate what we can refer to as cosmic justice. This requires much monitoring and a great deal of authoritarian input and control. It is essentially creating an artificial environment known as cosmic justice as opposed to traditional justice. For example, summer camps designed for the good of dysfunctional and disadvantaged children often turned into camp nurture of little criminals. Social programs and idiot-enabling intervention allows the bar to be dropped, which more often than not hobbles performers and indulges non-performers on the basis of Rawley's misguided generalism that undeserved inequalities call for redress. Equal opportunity, that is, filling quotas, doesn't result in equality of outcome. Do not confuse the two. Because, to quote Mr. Peterson, women don't want to be bricklayers and men don't want to be midwives. So the lesson is not to confuse an equity-orientated ethos with equality of outcome. Number 3 on our E's is ethnic studies. This is a real political Trojan horse, these ethnic studies. It often enters into schooling under the guise of ethnic studies, and then morphs into woke, misguided civics consciousness, and then can further degenerate into indoctrination and perpetual victimhood, student cynicism, childhood disillusionment, and attempts to rewrite history and the practice of cancel culture sedition. Now we move on to the F's in Riddell's war chest. The glossary, number 1, F is for fascism. When tribalism and nationalism throw off constraint, suppress all and any political opposition, and consider even the uncomfortable questions a threat to national security, we are left with fascism. Originally, it meant total emulation of a leader and the inability or unwillingness to tolerate any view that differs from their own. These are the predicates that cause descent into a national cult, driven by a totalitarian government, as evidenced by North Korea, China, Russia, and several African and Islamic states. Fascism, not a nice word, an even worse scenario. And number 2 on the F's is the factoid. The factoid is repeated false information until it gains credibility and somehow morphs into a fact. This practice is essential to the dissemination of propaganda and those legally dodgy mandates, as evidenced by international governmental attempts to mandate the reception and acceptance, for example, of mRNA, the vaccine, as a safe and effective compulsory solution. Mandated mask wearing, save your granny, wear a mask. Other emergency mandates, the legally enforceable support of homosexual marriage, as if it were essentially amoral behaviour. It's not. And transgender transitioning as perfectly normal, perfectly healthy autogynephilia. Number 3 on the F's would be the FTX. Sam Bankman-Fried's cryptocurrency exchange and the American Democratic Party's source of new wealth. Midterm elections 2022. Do you remember what happened? Until it was bankrupted after the FTX blew up $32 billion and evaporated $2 billion and lost, that is, missing Bitcoin. A much bigger scandal than Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme, but attracting far less media publicity, probably because so few journalists even understood it or how it came about. Number 4 of the F's is freedom of speech. Freedom of speech. Without direct censoring by civil or military authorities or punitive legislation, it safeguards the freedom of religion and is utterly essential to the dialogue that replaces violence in a civilized society, and a right which millions of people have given their lives in war to protect. When in the entire history of language did the use of English require legislation to control it, asks Jordan Peterson, and I hope we're asking it as well. Only ever under foreign totalitarian governments, Russian Stalinism, Germany's Third Reich, Italy's Mussolini fascism, but never ever in the history of modern English-speaking humanity. Anne Widdecombe comments that if indeed we oppose it, it is only by first hearing it that we can finally destroy it. But how can we hear it if it's forbidden to say it? This plague is now slowly spreading its grip across the free world in a new stealth, driven by wokeism and a wrong-headed view of inclusivism. Number 5 on the list of F's is feminism. First formed as a collectivist ideological weapon against all discrimination and to give equal access to opportunity for all women, it has often degenerated into male hate speech and activities designed to disempower men in their turn. Female anger and aggression gets overlooked by the feminist movement as being less dangerous than male anger and violence. It is usually manifested more subtly as gossip, innuendo, and reputation destruction, comments Jordan Peterson. It is also showing up as sons who are in conflict with their own masculinity, suppressing it through shame or even intimidation, itself often induced by militaristic feminism. Number 6 on the F's is fundamental human rights. We are all in agreement that this is something that everyone should have access to. But when do my rights allow me to kill, or confine, or retaliate against another human being, whether in the act of self-defense or under state command? On this there is much disagreement and much state hypocrisy as each culture wrestles to take the higher moral ground. Number 7 of the F's is fusions of the mind. This one's a real doozy. Listen up. You might be about to hear something you've never heard before. The failure of unschooled brains to distinguish concepts that are essentially different is what this is about. This is actually the psychological culprit behind all of the confusion and therefore most of the resultant evil at work in the world today. This really is the jackpot. For example, number 1, correlation is confused with causation. To illustrate, we now know that the fog, the miasmas, did not cause the typhoid outbreaks of 18th century London, although there seemed to be a repeated close correlation in the timing. Do not confuse correlation with causation. Example number 2 of these fusions is conversion therapy does not equal therapeutic coercion. Conversion, coercion, not the same. Mainly because coerced change is never permanent change, but occurs only under obligation of external factors and lacks respect, which is the space that allows buy-in, ownership, you might say, from the beginning. Whether Muslim, Christian, heterosexual or gay, the man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. And who doesn't know that in the faculties that inform common sense? Faculties that apparently departed all those who voted for the well-intentioned but utterly misguided legislation outlawing the right to have a discussion about factors that might have set one up for homosexual orientation in the years before these influences could be cognitively considered. Sorry, a therapeutic conversation about these preformative factors is now out of bounds. Example number 3 of these fusions would be evolution between species utterly confused with the variation that occurs within species. And that confusion has held sway for over 100 years now and still not a missing link to be found anywhere. But don't dare mention it or your career as a scientist will be whipped out from under your outraged feet. Now, science is supposed to follow the evidence, but evolution follows the ideology. But as George Orwell said, there doesn't have to be a conspiracy wherever there's a convergence of interests. Example of fusion number 4 should be love. Love should never be confused with unconditional indulgence, otherwise known variously as enabling, rescuing, and over-functioning. Now, when parents and even grandparents believe the core of their care for the child comes down to trying to make sure that that child never suffers any disappointment, they have a narcissistic, personality disordered human in the making. And they themselves are certainly responsible for that unfortunate psychiatric maldevelopment and the social misfit it results in. Sad but true. Example number 5 of these fusions is the commercial quote of the contractor, a matter of keeping one's word of commitment, confused with the contracting estimate, where the matter is one of best guesstimate. You know, the ballpark figure. And then will come tears, to say nothing of the extensive legal battles that are almost certain to follow. Do not confuse the estimate with the quote. Example number 6 of a common fusion would be feelings being elevated to the status of facts. Woke philosophy, a product of postmodernism, complains, "Don't bully us with the facts. Whatever we feel strongly enough about is deemed to be true. My truth need not conform to your truth." Now, there are differences in perspective, of course, but there is no your truth and my truth. There is only truth, the right description of reality, and error, the misrepresentation of reality. And despite all protests to the contrary, reality still knows only 2 genders. Example 7 of the fusions is when even the descendants of victims are deemed to be innocent and even powerless to change and therefore urgently in need of reparation rights, then the stage is set for identity politics of a crucial nature to break out and wreak their havoc in diverse yet previously harmonic communities until the strife of historical injustice and outrage were visited upon them. Example number 8. When disappointing others is confused with letting them down and betraying their trust. A major perpetrator of false guilt is unleashed on many unsuspecting, sensitive people, causing massive and unnecessary mental suffering to the simple, even naive-minded. Example number 9, when racist is confused with any observations made that dare to make any distinctions between the characteristics of cultures and race whatsoever, then our ability to identify and even talk about these differences becomes forbidden. And if so, nothing can be done about them without risking being ousted from the game by such accusations. And while we're at it, ditto for the difference between sexist and sexism. So, in conclusion the F's, I'm reminded of a brilliant little comment Malcolm Gladwell made in his noteworthy book, The Outliers. In it he says, intelligence turns out to be the ability to make the subtle but necessary distinctions. So, where's your level of intelligence sitting these days? I hope you've enjoyed the E to F's of the Riddell Glossary, The War Chest. I find words powerful, helpful, and when well handed, incredibly illuminating. David Riddell, The War Chest. If you like what I've said so far, let me remind you that you can download the entire transcript for free. Click here and you'll be able to read it for yourself.